March 2, 2026, 02:17, Gulf Standard Time. Above the Persian Gulf, the night is deceptively quiet. Oil terminals glimmer like distant beacons. On board the USS Baton, radar operators monitor for signs of movement. In Tel Aviv, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and defense chiefs watch screens for any unusual trajectory. Across the region, the world braces. 4 days earlier, a coordinated U.S.-Israeli campaign known as Operation Epic Fury in Washington and Operation Roaring Lion in Israeli communications struck Iran's military infrastructure, command centers, and strategic facilities. The operation eliminated Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and severely disrupted the country's command networks. Now, in the early hours of March 2, Iran retaliates with a wide-ranging missile and drone campaign, its own defensive counterstrike, targeting U.S. bases, allied installations, and strategic points across the region. The operation is systematic and precise, a direct response to the earlier strikes. Radar screens flare, interceptors launch, satellite feeds capture missiles streaking across pre-dawn skies, financial markets spike. Civilians in Gulf cities strain to understand what this escalation means. This is not symbolic retaliation. It is strategic recalibration. Deterrence has shifted. Assumptions about limited engagement have shattered. To understand why this moment unfolded, we must go back to the months of escalating pressure, intelligence maneuvers, and political brinkmanship that led directly to the retaliation. The months leading to March 2026 had seen tensions simmer across the Middle East, far beyond routine border disputes or proxy skirmishes. U.S. and Israeli intelligence had identified the consolidation of Iran's missile forces, drone fleets, and regional proxy networks. Israel, under Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, increased aerial reconnaissance over northern Iran and southern Iraq, mapping command centers and storage depots. Washington, guided by former President Donald Trump's Strategic Council, deployed additional naval assets to the Persian Gulf, including missile destroyers and carrier strike groups, to reinforce deterrence and demonstrate rapid response capability. Iran, anticipating escalation, had accelerated its own defensive protocols. President Ebrahim Raisi and the military high command ordered deployment of the Khorramshahr ballistic brigades, drone swarms, and cyber defense units across strategic sites. The death of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, though initially uncertain, had already begun to shift internal military coordination. Tehran's generals feared that any misstep could invite further precision strikes. Diplomacy during this period had stalled. Multiple rounds of talks with the United States and European intermediaries collapsed, leaving sanctions enforcement and strategic ambiguity as the primary levers of influence. Iran interpreted U.S. naval maneuvers as overt threats. Israel interpreted Iranian drone activity near its borders as provocations requiring preemptive planning. The stage was set for a confrontation where miscalculations could escalate rapidly. The intelligence picture was complex. Satellite imagery, intercepted communications, and human intelligence painted a picture of Iranian forces dispersed but highly capable. Analysts noted Iran's emphasis on redundancy. Command centers were layered, missiles were mobile, and anti-air systems were networked to compensate for gaps. The U.S. and Israel considered these factors carefully, weighing the risks of a full-scale operation against the potential to neutralize key Iranian assets without triggering uncontrollable escalation. By early February, contingency plans were finalized. The U.S. and Israeli militaries had aligned on Operation Epic Fury, a precise, coordinated strike aimed at degrading Iran's command, control, and missile capabilities. Tehran, aware that its assets were being monitored, quietly codified its retaliatory protocols, ready to launch counterattacks at the first sign of intrusion. The stage was set. Both sides were preparing to act decisively, each interpreting the other's movements as existential signals. It was a delicate balance of power, a tense chessboard where a single miscalculation could ignite the entire region. Beyond direct U.S.-Iran tensions, the entire Middle East had become a web of overlapping interests and fragile alliances. Saudi Arabia, the Gulf Cooperation Council, and other regional powers watched the buildup warily, calculating how a confrontation between Tehran, Washington, and Jerusalem could shift regional dominance. Oil exports, shipping lanes through the Strait of Hormuz, and global trade routes hung in a delicate balance, their disruption threatening economies far beyond the Gulf. Proxy conflicts added layers of complexity. Iran's influence extended through militias in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, while the United States and Israel maintained support networks for counterbalancing forces. Each side's action risked triggering not just direct retaliation, but broader instability. Drone swarms, cyber attacks, and special operations became tools in an invisible war, shaping perceptions as much as real capabilities. Tehran's leadership, even after Khamenei's death, emphasized defensive posture while signaling resolve. Any aggression against Iranian territory would be met with immediate, proportionate response. Diplomatic avenues had narrowed to near impossibility. European powers and the United Nations struggled to mediate, but their efforts were overshadowed by the rapid deployment of forces on both sides. Washington's strategic communications under Donald Trump emphasized strength and deterrence, warning that any Iranian strike would provoke decisive countermeasures. Meanwhile, Israel's military posture, reinforced with intelligence sharing and prepositioned interceptors, indicated readiness for escalation at any hour. The combination of regional uncertainty, high-stakes intelligence, and hardened leadership created a volatile environment. Even minor miscalculations could cascade into a full-scale confrontation. By late February 2026, both Tehran and Washington Jerusalem had finalized operational plans, Operation Epic Fury for the U.S. and Israel, and Iran's structured counterstrike protocol ready to respond. Each side believed it could control the escalation, but the very existence of these plans created pressure points where unpredictability could dominate. February 28, March 3, 2026. Before dawn on February 28, 2026, the world watched in uneasy anticipation. Months of buildup, intelligence tracking, and strategic posturing had brought the region to a fragile brink. Then, at sunrise, the long-prepared offensive began. On that day, Operation Epic Fury, the coordinated military campaign conducted by the United States and Israel, was launched. In precision strikes across Iran, waves of missiles. Bombers and drones opened the offensive. Air defenses lit up the sky above Tehran, intercepting some incoming projectiles and registering others that slipped through deep into territory once thought beyond reach. The assault struck military bases, missile launch complexes, air defense sites, and strategic infrastructure designed to protect Iran's military capabilities. Briefings in command centers spoke of hundreds of targets, from ballistic missile depots in the west to logistics hubs in the south. Fighter jets, long aloft, released munitions with calculated accuracy. Warships in the Gulf fired long-range missiles toward hardened positions. By midday, explosions had ripped through Tehran's outskirts, echoing against ancient minarets and modern skyscrapers alike. Amidst the thunder, Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was killed in one of the strikes on the leadership compound, shaking the nation's command structure and setting off a wave of shock and mourning. Across the country, communications went dark, sirens wailed, and emergency orders were broadcast through disrupted networks. Within hours, Iran's response unfolded. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps mobilized missile brigades and drone wings. From launch sites stretching across the country, salvos of ballistic missiles and unmanned aerial vehicles arced toward designated targets. Israel's skies shuddered under the pressure of incoming threats. Sirens blared over Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, forcing civilians underground into shelters. Some strikes found their marks, others were intercepted. Conflict had leapt from strategy rooms into living rooms and marketplaces. At the same time, Iranian attacks struck American military facilities across the Gulf region. U.S. bases in Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates were targeted with coordinated missile and drone barrages. Anti-air defenses bloomed like flak gardens in night skis as Allied forces scrambled systems to intercept inbound threats. In Kuwait, the situation grew chaotic. In a tragic incident of confusion under stress, 3 U.S. fighter jets were shot down by friendly fire, their pilots surviving but the event underscoring the fog of war. Ground units and naval assets were forced to reinforce perimeter defenses, while command staffs juggled reacting to simultaneous fronts. As the day wore on, Iranian forces also struck beyond Israel and U.S. positions. Reports of attacks on energy infrastructure echoed across the region, from Saudi Arabian oil installations, shuttered by drone impacts, to Gulf commercial hubs, where shipping lanes were disrupted, signaling that the crisis was now reverberating through global trade arteries and markets. By March 1, the conflict entered a broader phase. Israel continued its campaign with targeted bombardments on Iranian military infrastructure and Iranian-backed militia strongholds in Lebanon and Syria. Hezbollah, aligned with Tehran, launched missiles into northern Israel as part of a secondary front, prompting intense Israeli counterstrikes that left civilian districts scarred and quiet roads transformed into rubble-strewn avenues of displacement. Across the region, each exchange added to the narrative of a war that had begun with meticulously coordinated strikes, but was quickly expanding beyond original intentions. Missile trails and drone contrails carved arcs across sunlight and darkness alike. Alerts sounded in capitals far from the battlefield, and diplomatic cables sparked emergency calls between distant foreign ministries trying to prevent total unraveling. Deterrence, once assumed stable, had collapsed into retaliation upon retaliation. What started as a planned offensive had cascaded into an unpredictable, kinetic chain reaction. By the early hours of March 2, the full scope of the hostilities was evident. U.S. and Israeli forces, still committed to Operation Epic Fury, unleashed a second wave of air operations, deepening attacks into Iran's military heartlands. Ballistic missile launch sites, air defense nodes, and intelligence hubs were struck with renewed precision. Fighter squadrons loosed standoff munitions designed to disable mobile launch platforms and disrupt missile networks. Naval bombardments from the Gulf and Arabian Sea supported aerial operations with long-range firepower. Simultaneously, Iran's retaliation did not relent. Missile barrages continued toward major Israeli cities, forcing repeated activations of air defense systems that illuminated night skies with streaks of interceptors. Civilians in urban centers felt the vibrations beneath their feet, watched alerts crawl across their screens, and adjusted to a new rhythm where the sound of sirens preceded the flash of distant explosions. Iran's long-range strikes also focused on bases that hosted U.S. personnel and allied units. These attacks were simultaneous and synchronized, designed to overwhelm defenses and demonstrate capability beyond symbolic gestures. Urban centers in the Gulf states felt the tremors of impacts as nations with minimal involvement found themselves responding to threats on their own soil. By late March 2, the conflict had pushed beyond a bilateral fight. Lebanese militias continued firing into northern Israel, prompting follow-on air raids. Syrian territories adjacent to Israel saw renewed bombardments aimed at militia logistics lines. In Gulf capitals, governments condemned attacks and convened security councils to discuss defensive postures, troop deployments, and civilian protection measures. Across the region, crisis communications became a non-stop rhythm. Plans that once sat on classified servers were now executed in real time. Command posts in Washington, Jerusalem, Doha, Riyadh, and Amman were crowded with analysts, generals, and advisors weighing each decision for its ripple effects. For both sides, the initial intention, whether to degrade capabilities or to assert deterrence, had been eclipsed. The momentum of conflict had taken on a life of its own. And as dawn broke on March 3, 2026, the Middle East no longer resembled a landscape of strategic tension. It had become a theater of active conflict, with front lines that blurred between borders, airspace that flickered with defensive fire, and a world that watched with widening concern. March 3, 2026. The first full day after Iran's retaliatory strikes, the Middle East was a landscape transformed. Cities still smoldered from the overnight barrage. Missile debris littered outskirts of Tel Aviv, U.S. bases in Kuwait were damaged, and the Persian Gulf shipping lanes were disrupted. Casualties were confirmed on both sides, military personnel and civilians caught in the crossfire, while emergency crews worked under the looming threat of further strikes. In Washington, Donald Trump appeared on national television, addressing the nation with a mixture of resolve and caution. He called the strikes against Iran a necessary operation to defend American interests and allies in the region, emphasizing that U.S. forces had acted decisively to remove key leadership targets and degrade military capabilities. Trump warned that further aggression from Iran would be met with overwhelming response, but framed the campaign as a measured step to prevent broader regional escalation. Across the world, markets remained volatile, and intelligence agencies assessed whether Iran would escalate further or negotiate under the pressure of targeted military losses. Israel reinforced northern and southern borders, preparing for additional missile threats, while Tehran faced the dual challenge of rallying a shocked population after the death of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and coordinating a fractured military command structure under heavy operational pressure. The message from both sides was clear. The balance of power had shifted, deterrence had been tested, and the consequences of miscalculation would define the coming weeks. The world had witnessed a direct confrontation unlike any in decades, an event that demonstrated the lethal precision of modern warfare and the fragility of regional stability. In the wake of explosions and retaliatory strikes, political leaders, civilians, and military commanders alike faced the sobering reality. In 2026, conflict in the Middle East could no longer remain a distant possibility. It was here, it was immediate, and it demanded urgent recalibration of strategy, diplomacy, and survival. As the dust settled over the Persian Gulf and the skies cleared of smoke trails, the world was left to absorb the lessons of March 2026. What began as calculated strikes and precise retaliations had unveiled the delicate web of alliances, deterrence, and fragile diplomacy that governs the Middle East. Technology, intelligence, and military precision had collided with human uncertainty, and the consequences were stark. Lives lost, infrastructure shattered, and a region forced to confront the costs of miscalculation. For the United States and Israel, the operations demonstrated the power of coordinated action, yet also the limits of control once engagement spreads beyond borders. For Iran, the death of its supreme leader and the disruption of command structures revealed both vulnerability and resilience, as its military adapted rapidly to respond under pressure. The civilian populations, caught between strategy rooms and missile trajectories, became living reminders of the human toll beneath geopolitical chessboards. March 2026 stands as a moment of historical inflection, a reminder that in modern conflict, the distinction between deterrence and provocation can vanish within hours. The strategies of war, the capabilities of modern arsenals, and the decisions of a few leaders can cascade into consequences that reshape nations, economies, and global perceptions. Ultimately, this confrontation reaffirmed that the lessons of history endure. Power is not absolute. Technology is not a shield against uncertainty. And while states may pursue objectives with logic and calculation, the human, emotional, and unpredictable dimensions of conflict remain. In 2026, the Middle East experienced a stark confrontation, and the reverberations will echo long after the last missile has landed.